What unfolds when a billionaire disguises himself as an ordinary traveler and uncovers the corruption eroding his own airline. A daring quest for justice begins, one that challenges authority, dismantles prejudice, and redefines what's possible. Before we dive into this story, let us know in the comments, what time are you listening to this, and where are you from? The morning sun bathed the sprawling expanse of Aurora International Airport in a warm, golden light. This bustling hub connected the vibrant metropolis of Grand Harbor to the world. Inside Terminal B, the atmosphere hummed with life. Boarding announcements echoed overhead, suitcases rolled along polished floors, and a symphony of voices filled the air, each carrying a unique story. The terminal reflected the city's heart, a vibrant tapestry of cultures, languages, and dreams merging under one roof. Towering LED screens adorned the walls, playing commercials for Stellar Skies Airlines. The tagline, "Where you're always welcome," glowed brightly, promising passengers an unmatched travel experience. But beneath the polished veneer of these advertisements, reality often told a more sobering tale. The terminal revealed a sharp contrast. At one end, economy-class counters overflowed with travelers. Long lines of weary passengers juggled bags and boarding passes while children clung to parents. Occasionally, heated arguments erupted over delays or extra baggage fees. Meanwhile, the VIP section radiated luxury. Guests breezed through check-ins, assisted by attendants who offered warm smiles and personalized service. Amid this controlled chaos, a man stood out, not because of his appearance, but because of how seamlessly he blended in. Clad in a plain gray t-shirt, dark jeans, and worn sneakers, Daniel Hayes carried a modest black backpack slung over his shoulder. His unassuming look gave no hint that he was one of the nation's wealthiest individuals and the owner of Stellar Skies Airlines. Daniel had built his business empire from scratch, defying stereotypes and overcoming obstacles that would have deterred most. But today, he wasn't here as a billionaire or CEO. He was just another passenger. As he moved through the terminal with a sharp, observant gaze, Daniel noticed troubling signs. At the economy-class check-in desk, a middle-aged woman with curly hair argued with an airline agent. Her voice trembled as she explained that her luggage met the weight limit, but the agent dismissed her without even looking up from their computer. A few feet away, a young man with tan skin and a nervous expression was pulled aside for an additional security screening. Despite having cleared the metal detector without issue, Daniel's jaw tightened. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a deeper problem festering within the company he had worked so hard to build. The VIP check-in counter for Stellar Skies gleamed under the terminal's bright lights. Its sleek marble surface and gold-accented signage exuded exclusivity. Behind the counter stood Clara Mills, a woman with a perfectly pressed uniform and blonde hair styled into a tight bun. She carried an air of professionalism at first glance, but a closer look revealed a slight smirk curling her lips, more disdainful than welcoming. Daniel stepped forward and handed over his ticket and ID, his calm demeanor unwavering. Clara's eyes flicked over his simple attire, her brow furrowing slightly. "Are you sure you're in the right line?" she asked, her tone laced with condescension. "Yes, I'm sure," Daniel replied evenly. Clara pursed her lips, holding his ID as if searching for a flaw. She turned to her computer, her fingers moving deliberately slowly over the keys. The seconds stretched uncomfortably, punctuated only by the sound of her nails tapping on the keyboard. "This ticket seems unusual," she finally said, her voice lowering to a murmur loud enough for others nearby to overhear. "I'll need to verify it with the supervisor." Daniel took a measured breath. "There's nothing unusual about it. It's a confirmed booking for seat 1A in first class." Clara raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. Instead, she picked up the phone and spoke softly into the receiver. Daniel stood quietly, his patience wearing thin, though his expression remained composed. Nearby, a couple of sharply dressed travelers cast curious glances in his direction, their faces a mix of intrigue and judgment. After several minutes, Clara's conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a man in a perfectly tailored navy suit. His polished shoes clicked against the floor as he approached with an air of authority and arrogance. This was Victor Lane, the manager of Stellar Skies Aurora operations. "Is there a problem here?" Victor asked, his eyes briefly landing on Clara before shifting to Daniel with a thin veneer of courtesy. Clara's posture straightened immediately as Victor Lane approached. Her tone shifted to one of deference as she spoke. "Mr. Lane, I just needed confirmation on this passenger's ticket. It seemed unusual for this counter." Victor didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied Daniel Hayes carefully, his sharp eyes scanning Daniel's casual attire. His lips curved into a thin, dismissive smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Everything appears to be in order," Victor said finally, handing the ticket back to Clara with a curt nod. "Make sure to expedite this process." "Yes, Mr. Lane," Clara replied, though her reluctance was evident in her tone. Victor turned to Daniel and extended a hand. The handshake was mechanical, a mere formality. "Enjoy your flight," he said smoothly, his words distant and impersonal. "Thank you," Daniel replied simply, meeting Victor's gaze with steady confidence. As Daniel walked away, he couldn't shake the weight of the encounter. Clara's behavior wasn't just poor customer service, it was symptomatic of a deeper issue. Victor's indifferent response only confirmed Daniel's growing suspicion. This was not an isolated incident. Daniel boarded the plane and found his seat in the luxurious first-class cabin. The leather seats were plush, the service refined, yet the tension from earlier lingered in his mind. As the flight attendants bustled around the cabin, Daniel's eyes caught sight of Clara again. She moved a few rows ahead, her demeanor now noticeably warmer as she interacted with passengers who fit the unspoken mold of VIP. Her smile was genuine, her tone accommodating. It was a sharp contrast to how she had treated him earlier. Daniel leaned back in his seat, letting his gaze drift to the tarmac outside. His thoughts churned, a mix of frustration and determination. This wasn't just about Clara or even Victor Lane. It was about the culture they represented, one that contradicted everything he envisioned for Stellar Skies Airlines. This flight wasn't just about traveling to Sol Vista, it was the start of an investigation. From the frontline staff to upper management, Daniel was determined to uncover every layer of the problem and fix it, no matter how deeply he had to dig. The hum of the aircraft filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats. Daniel reclined slightly, his sharp eyes scanning the polished surroundings. The crew moved with precision, their steps silent on the carpeted floor. Despite the cabin's comforts, a subtle tension hung in the air, one Daniel couldn't ignore. He turned his attention to the window as the plane taxied to the runway. This was supposed to be a quiet observation mission, a way to evaluate the company he had built from scratch. But every interaction thus far gnawed at him. Stellar Skies was more than a business to him. It was his mission to create a place where everyone felt valued, regardless of who they were. Yet, in just a few hours, he had seen behavior that betrayed that mission. As the plane lifted into the sky, Daniel shifted his focus back to the cabin. Clara moved briskly through the aisle, her smile polished and professional. Yet Daniel noted how her actions betrayed her true priorities. A man 2 rows ahead, Greg Alston, a wealthy executive wearing an expensive watch, snapped his fingers for attention. Clara was at his side in an instant. "Could I get a glass of Sauvignon Blanc? And some almonds, too?" Alston asked, his tone dripping with entitlement. "Of course, Mr. Alston," Clara replied warmly. She returned moments later with a chilled glass of wine and a porcelain bowl of almonds. Daniel observed as Clara lingered by Alston's seat, engaging him in light conversation and complimenting his tie. When Alston chuckled, Clara joined in, her laugh bright and eager. Moments later, Daniel caught Clara's eye and raised a hand politely to signal for her attention. She approached, her expression neutral, as if bracing for an unpleasant task. "Yes?" she asked curtly. "I'd like a glass of water, please," Daniel said evenly. Clara hesitated before nodding. "I'll get that for you in just a moment." But the moment stretched into several minutes. Daniel watched as she attended to other passengers, handing out blankets and chatting before disappearing into the galley. His frustration simmered beneath the surface. When Clara finally returned, she placed the glass of water on his tray table without a word or a glance. "Thank you," Daniel said calmly but firmly. Clara walked away without acknowledging him. Nearby, a woman seated across the aisle, a well-dressed figure in a tailored navy suit, cast a curious glance in Daniel's direction. Her expression was a mixture of judgment and intrigue, as though trying to decipher why someone dressed so plainly sat among the elite. Daniel exhaled slowly, his patience tested but intact. The series of dismissive interactions wasn't just frustrating, it reinforced the systemic biases he suspected were woven into Stellar Sky's culture. He leaned back in his seat, watching the clouds blur past the window. The journey ahead would not just be about flying to Sol Vista. It would be about confronting the very foundation of his company and ensuring it became the airline he had always envisioned. As Daniel glanced around the cabin, he noticed a woman seated across the aisle. She wore an elegant navy dress paired with pearls, embodying the essence of old money refinement. Her gaze lingered on his casual attire, her expression subtly judgmental, as if trying to decipher why he belonged among them. Daniel exhaled slowly, steeling himself against the weight of the moment. Every dismissive glance and slight interaction compounded his growing awareness of the systemic biases embedded in Stellar Sky's culture, biases he had worked so hard to eliminate. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir, do you need anything else?" Daniel looked up to see Emily Rivers, the young flight attendant, with a warm smile. Unlike Clara, Emily's demeanor was genuine, her tone free of pretense. "No, I'm fine, thank you," Daniel replied, his voice softening. Emily lingered for a moment. "If you need anything, just let me know. I'll be around," she said before walking away. Daniel observed her interactions as she moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, addressing every request with the same care, regardless of the passenger's status. Later, as Emily passed his seat again, Daniel gestured for her attention. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Emily paused, curiosity flickering in her expression. "Of course, what's on your mind?" Daniel hesitated, then asked, "You seem different from some of the other crew members. More attentive. How do you manage to stay so focused?" Emily glanced around to ensure no one was listening before leaning in slightly. "It's not always easy," she admitted in a hushed tone. "This job can be tough, especially with the kind of pressure we face. Not everyone handles it well." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What kind of pressure?" Emily hesitated, then spoke cautiously. "Working under Victor Lane isn't exactly pleasant. He has his favorites. If you're not one of them, you're expendable." Her words hit Daniel like a cold wind. This wasn't just about poor training or individual biases. It was a culture steeped in favoritism and fear. "Thank you for your honesty," Daniel said. Emily offered a faint smile, gratitude flickering in her eyes. "I just want to do my job the right way. Some of us still care about that." As Emily walked away, Daniel leaned back in his seat, his thoughts racing. Amid the sea of complacency and prejudice, Emily was a rare example of what Stellar Skies was supposed to represent. Yet her words revealed an even deeper problem, one that went far beyond Clara's attitude or the passengers' judgmental stares. Daniel stared out the window as the city lights below faded into darkness. The plane soared higher, but his resolve only deepened. This wasn't just about observing anymore, it was about taking action. Later, Daniel's thoughts were interrupted by Clara approaching his row with a tray of meals. "Here's your entree," she said curtly, placing a plate on his tray table with minimal care. Daniel glanced down. It wasn't the meal he had requested when booking the flight. The steak he had selected was replaced by chicken with sides he hadn't chosen. "This isn't what I ordered," Daniel said, looking up at Clara. She barely glanced at him. "We ran out of the steak option. You'll have to make do," she replied dismissively. Daniel could feel the eyes of nearby passengers on him. Despite his patience wearing thin, he spoke calmly. "Could you check again?" "I confirmed my meal preference when I booked." Clara let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. "Like I said, sir, we're out." Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Daniel with the lukewarm plate of food in front of him. From across the cabin, Daniel noticed Emily casting a concerned glance his way. She seemed hesitant, perhaps wary of how Clara might react if she stepped in. A few moments later, Clara returned to the galley, where Daniel overheard her snapping instructions at another attendant. Her voice carried an edge of impatience. "I don't care if he's upset. Just get through the service and move on," she barked. Daniel shifted in his seat, his gaze following Clara, as she continued issuing sharp, almost militant orders. Her mannerisms exuded control, but they also revealed an unsettling tendency to thrive on instilling fear. Emily, meanwhile, continued her tasks with quiet composure, even as Clara directed a particularly harsh comment her way. "Rivers, you're taking too long. These passengers don't have all day," Clara said loudly, ensuring the nearby passengers could hear. Emily responded evenly, her professionalism unwavering. "I'm just making sure their requests are taken care of." Clara rolled her eyes and walked away, leaving Emily to continue her tasks undeterred. The tension in the air was palpable, the crew's morale visibly strained under Clara's overbearing leadership. Every dismissive comment, every poorly handled situation painted a picture of a systemic problem far larger than one flight. Discreetly, Daniel pulled out a small notebook from his backpack and began jotting down observations. He documented every slight, every exchange, every action that reflected the deeper issues plaguing the company. Later, Emily passed by his seat again and paused. "I'm really sorry about earlier," she said quietly, her voice tinged with genuine concern. Emily's voice softened with genuine concern. "I'll see if I can get you something else," she said. "It's not your fault," Daniel replied, his voice dropping slightly. Then after a pause he asked, "But is this kind of thing normal?" Emily hesitated, her eyes darting around to ensure Clara wasn't nearby. "It depends on who's in charge," she admitted. "Some people are great to work with, but others make it hard, especially if you're not their type." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" Emily's voice dropped further. "Clara isn't the worst. She's just following the example set by Victor Lane. He has his favorites, and they get away with things the rest of us can't. It trickles down, how we're treated, how we're judged. It's exhausting." Her words struck Daniel deeply. This wasn't just about Clara's behavior. It was about a broader culture, one shaped by the very person responsible for overseeing Stellar Sky's operations at Aurora. "Thank you for your honesty," Daniel said, his tone sincere. Emily offered a faint, tight-lipped smile before moving on to assist another passenger. As Daniel sat back, processing what he'd learned, the depth of the problem became clearer. He had boarded this flight expecting to find cracks in the system, but it was now evident that the foundation itself was flawed. The culture of favoritism and bias wasn't just present, it was being actively perpetuated by those at the top. His resolve hardened. This wasn't about fixing one person's poor behavior, it was about uprooting an entire structure of dysfunction. The plane glided smoothly over the vast Midwest plains, engines emitting a steady hum. Daniel sat quietly, his thoughts swirling as he observed the dynamics within the first-class cabin. The tension was no longer subtle, it was present in every interaction, every glance. Clara moved through the aisle with an air of sharp authority. Her demeanor was commanding, almost overbearing. She hovered over the younger crew members, correcting them with curt remarks and pointed gestures. Emily, though composed, wore a subtle look of exhaustion. Her attempts to provide genuine service were frequently undermined by Clara's domineering presence. Daniel watched as Clara leaned over another attendant, her voice sharp enough to carry. "That's not how we fold the blankets. If you can't get it right, don't bother," she snapped. The younger attendant nodded quickly, avoiding eye contact as they hurried away. Daniel's jaw tightened. It wasn't just Clara's lack of professionalism, it was the way she thrived on instilling fear in her colleagues. When Clara passed Daniel's seat, he raised his hand to get her attention. "Excuse me. I'd like to speak with the flight manager," he said evenly. Clara arched a brow, her tone clipped. "Why? I have a concern I'd like to address," Daniel replied calmly. Clara's lips curled into a tight, humorless smile. "That won't be necessary. Everything is under control." Daniel met her gaze steadily, his voice firm but composed. "I'd still like to speak with them." Clara's tone remained sharp. "I'll let them know," she said, though the dismissive way she turned and walked away suggested she had no intention of doing so. Daniel exhaled slowly, his patience wearing thin. Across the cabin, Emily caught his eye briefly, her expression apologetic. It said more than words ever could. A quiet apology for a situation she couldn't change. As the flight continued, Daniel pieced together the puzzle. Everything Emily had shared kept pointing back to one name. Victor Lane. Over and over, Clara's dismissive remarks made it clear that Victor's influence extended far beyond the walls of Aurora Airport. He had cultivated a culture where appearances and power mattered more than competence or fairness. Daniel's thoughts were interrupted by a commotion coming from the economy section. A passenger had collapsed near the restroom, and faint murmurs of concern reached the first-class cabin. Moments later, Emily rushed past Daniel's seat to assist. She knelt beside the passenger, an older man who appeared pale and disoriented. A nearby attendant called for medical help over the intercom as Emily worked to make the man comfortable. Daniel stood, instinct taking over. He approached Emily. "Is there anything I can do to help?" he asked. Emily looked up, gratitude flickering in her eyes, though uncertainty clouded her expression. "We might need to move him somewhere with more space. First class would be better." Before Daniel could respond, Clara arrived, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Yenna, she assessed the situation with a quick glance and shook her head. "He stays here. We can't disrupt the cabin," she said firmly. Emily blinked in disbelief. "But Clara, he needs room to." Clara interrupted Emily with an icy tone. "And what do you think the other passengers will say?" "No. Handle it here." Daniel stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "This man's health is far more important than maintaining appearances. Moving him to first class is the logical choice." Clara turned to Daniel, her expression cold and unyielding. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but we have protocols to follow." "Protocols that prioritize optics over people?" Daniel shot back, his frustration evident. For a moment, Clara stiffened, her composure faltering under his steady gaze. Then she turned back to Emily, her tone sharp. "Do what you can here," she said before walking away. With the assistance of a doctor on board, the passenger was eventually stabilized, but the incident left a bitter taste in Daniel's mouth. This wasn't just about Clara's refusal to help, it was about the systemic attitude she embodied. As Daniel returned to his seat, his mind solidified around a single conclusion. This wasn't just about observing anymore. Victor Lane's toxic influence had seeped into every level of the company, and it was time to confront it directly. The plane descended smoothly toward Sol Vista, the sprawling cityscape glowing beneath a soft orange sunset. Passengers gathered their belongings, the cabin buzzing with movement and conversation. Daniel, however, remained seated, his thoughts fixed on the confrontation ahead. The events of the flight replayed in his mind, Clara's blatant favoritism, her dismissive attitude toward passengers, and her resistance to Daniel's attempt to advocate for the sick man. Each moment confirmed a troubling reality. This wasn't about one person's behavior, it was systemic. Once the plane taxied to the gate, Daniel waited for the other passengers to disembark before stepping into the aisle. At the front of the cabin, Clara stood with a practiced professional smile, bidding farewell to travelers. When Daniel approached, her expression tightened ever so slightly. "Safe travels," she said, her voice clipped. "I need to speak with Victor Lane," Daniel replied evenly. Clara's eyes flickered with a mix of surprise and hesitation. "He's busy, but I'll see if I can reach him." She walked briskly toward the galley, picking up her phone. Daniel followed her with his gaze, catching snippets of her conversation. Though her voice was low, her tone carried a mix of disdain and condescension. "Yes, he's insisting on speaking with you. I don't know what his issue is, but it might be best to handle this quickly." Minutes later, Daniel was directed to a small office near the terminal. The door opened to reveal Victor Lane, impeccably dressed as always. His polished demeanor was offset by a subtle air of indifference. The office itself was minimalist but sleek, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bustling Sol Vista tarmac. "Mr. Hayes," Victor greeted, extending a hand. His tone was professional but carried an undercurrent of disinterest. "Clara mentioned you wanted to speak with me. What seems to be the issue?" Daniel shook his hand, holding his gaze steady. "I wanted to discuss the behavior I observed on this flight, both from the staff and the overall treatment of passengers." Victor gestured for Daniel to sit and leaned back in his chair with mild impatience. "I assure you, Stellar Skies holds itself to the highest standards. If there were any minor inconveniences, I'm sure we can address them without much trouble." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "It's more than minor inconveniences. I saw passengers being treated with disrespect, employees bullied by their superiors, and an unwillingness to prioritize customer well-being." Victor raised an eyebrow, his smile tightening. That's a rather strong assessment, don't you think? We pride ourselves on delivering premium service, especially in first class. Maybe that's the problem, Daniel replied. Your focus on appearances over substance is creating an environment where some people are valued more than others, both customers and staff. For the first time, Victor's polished mask slipped slightly. Well, Mr. Hayes, he said, leaning back in his chair, our VIP experience is tailored for individuals who fit certain expectations. Let's be honest, you don't see many people like yourself in first class. The words hung in the air, sharp and unapologetic. Daniel's expression remained calm, but his grip on the armrest tightened. What exactly do you mean by that? Victor hesitated for a fraction of a second before doubling down. We cater to a particular clientele. Executives, professionals, people accustomed to a certain level of sophistication. The insinuation was clear. Daniel's casual attire and unassuming demeanor had led Victor to make assumptions about him. Assumptions rooted in prejudice. Daniel stood slowly, his presence commanding. Thank you for your honesty, he said evenly. It's helped me see the full scope of the problem. Victor looked slightly taken aback. Problem? Mr. Hayes, if you're unhappy with your experience, I'm sure we can offer some form of compensation. I'm not looking for compensation, Daniel replied firmly. I'm looking to fix the culture of this company, Daniel said firmly, starting with the people who perpetuate the very attitudes you just displayed. Victor chuckled softly, though his laugh lacked any genuine humor. I think you might be overestimating your influence here. Daniel's expression remained calm, unwavering. You have no idea who I am, do you? Victor hesitated, his confidence momentarily faltering. Should I? You'll find out soon enough, Daniel replied. He turned toward the door, leaving the office with a renewed sense of purpose. The issues Daniel had seen were not isolated. They were symptoms of a deeply broken system. It was time to dismantle it piece by piece. The following morning, Daniel arranged for an emergency meeting at Stellar Sky's headquarters in Grand Harbor. Every department head, regional manager, and key decision-maker was summoned. The toxic foundation of the company he had built would be confronted, starting with those entrusted with its leadership. Later that evening, Daniel sat in his hotel room, the Sol Vista skyline glowing faintly through the window. He replayed his conversation with Victor Lane in his mind, dissecting every word and gesture. The man's arrogance had been infuriating, but what disturbed Daniel more was the ease with which Victor dismissed the very values Stellar Skies was supposed to stand for. Instead of revealing his identity in the heat of the moment, Daniel had chosen another path, one requiring patience, strategy, and evidence. Picking up his phone, he dialed Emily Rivers, the young flight attendant who had unwittingly become his ally. Emily, it's Daniel. He began, his tone steady. I need your help. Emily hesitated only briefly before responding, What do you need me to do? I need more information about Victor Lane, Daniel explained. His management style, how he treats employees, anything that paints a clearer picture. Can you do that? Emily's voice softened. I'll do my best, but people are scared of him. They won't talk easily. That's why we need to tread carefully, Daniel replied. This isn't about one flight or one person. It's about the culture he's created and how deep the damage runs. Over the next few days, Emily became an invaluable resource. She discreetly reached out to colleagues, gathering anecdotes and accounts of mistreatment under Victor's leadership. What she uncovered painted a grim picture. Employees overlooked for promotions despite their qualifications. Favoritism toward individuals who fit superficial ideals. A work environment rife with tension and fear. During one of their late-night calls, Emily shared, I spoke with one of the gate agents. She said Victor has this habit of tearing people down in public meetings. She's seen him single out employees and berate them for minor mistakes. No one stands up to him. They're too afraid of losing their jobs. Daniel jotted down notes, his mind racing. Anything about financial misconduct? Emily hesitated. Not directly. But I did hear something about company funds being used for unofficial purposes. There's a vendor who works closely with Victor, and some of the transactions don't add up. I can try to find out more. Be careful, Daniel warned. I don't want you putting yourself at risk. Despite his caution, Emily pressed on. Her efforts eventually led to a discovery that added an entirely new layer to the situation. During one of her shifts, she overheard a conversation between Victor and another manager regarding payments to a third-party contractor. The sums were substantial, but the services rendered were vague at best. Emily managed to quietly photograph a few documents left unattended in the office, documents that showed a pattern of questionable expenses tied directly to Victor. When she shared the photos with Daniel, he felt a cold certainty settle over him. This wasn't just about favoritism or toxic leadership anymore. It was about corruption. Daniel spent hours cross-referencing the information Emily provided with the company records he had access to as the owner of Stellar Skies. The deeper he dug, the clearer the picture became. Victor had been funneling company funds into deals with vendors who were either overcharging or providing unnecessary services. In several cases, these vendors had direct personal or financial ties to Victor. "This isn't just unethical," Daniel muttered to himself as he stared at the evidence spread across his laptop screen. "It's illegal." Leaning back in his chair, Daniel felt the stakes rising. Exposing Victor's actions wasn't just about accountability, it was about protecting the integrity of Stellar Skies as a whole. The following morning, Daniel made a call to the company's legal department, instructing them to prepare for an internal audit. He emphasized confidentiality, knowing that even the slightest hint of this investigation could give Victor time to cover his tracks. That evening, Daniel sat alone in his room, watching the city lights twinkle like distant stars. His decision to delay revealing his identity had been the right one. By gathering evidence and building a strong case, he was ensuring that when the time came to confront Victor, there would be no escape. This was no longer just a battle for respect. It was about restoring the soul of the company he had built. For Daniel, this wasn't just a fight for fairness. It was a fight for the soul of Stellar Skies Airlines, a company that bore his name, his vision, and his principles. He knew he couldn't stop until every layer of corruption and bias had been stripped away. That night, the air outside was still, as though bracing for the storm ahead. Daniel sat at his desk, illuminated by the soft glow of his laptop screen. Every detail of the corruption he'd uncovered swirled in his mind, forming a damning puzzle piece by piece. Yet doubt lingered. If he moved too quickly, Victor Lane could twist the narrative, painting Daniel as a disruptive outsider. But waiting too long risked giving Victor the opportunity to cover his tracks and shield himself behind the very people Daniel wanted to protect. Leaning back, Daniel exhaled deeply. His instincts urged him to act, but his experience demanded caution. He wasn't just fighting for control, he was fighting for the values Stellar Skies was built on. A text notification flashed across his phone, interrupting his thoughts. It was from Emily. "Clara's watching me closely. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Daniel immediately called her. She answered on the first ring, her voice low and cautious. "I think Clara suspects something," Emily said. "She's been piling on extra tasks to keep me away from the team, and I overheard her talking to Victor." "What did she say?" Daniel asked, his tone steady. "She told him you've been asking too many questions," Emily replied. "Victor sounded unsettled. He told her to keep you under watch and to make sure I don't talk to you again." Daniel frowned, his mind racing. "You need to stay under the radar, Emily. Don't put yourself at risk." "I'll be careful," she promised. "But Daniel, you need to act soon." Victor's starting to connect the dots. The call ended, leaving Daniel staring out the window, the city lights twinkling faintly in the distance. The stakes had escalated. Victor was catching on, and it wouldn't be long before he made his move. The next day, Daniel received an unexpected call from an anonymous number. The voice on the other end was hesitant but firm. "My name's Carter," the man began. "I'm a junior manager at Aurora. I don't know if this is the right thing to do, but I've seen too much to stay quiet." "What do you mean?" Daniel asked, keeping his tone calm. Carter hesitated before continuing. "Victor's been covering up violations for years. He's got people on his payroll who manipulate reports, sweep complaints under the rug, you name it. A lot of us know about it, but no one's willing to speak up." "Why are you telling me this now?" Daniel asked. "Because I've heard about what you're trying to do," Carter said. "And because I'm tired of watching good people get thrown under the bus while Victor lines his pockets." Carter's confession confirmed what Daniel had long suspected. But more than that, it gave him the final push he needed. "Thank you for trusting me," Daniel said. "I'm going to fix this, but I need your help to make sure he doesn't see it coming." That night, Daniel made his decision. He contacted Stellar Sky's legal and HR teams, instructing them to begin a comprehensive internal audit. He shared the evidence he and Emily had gathered, ensuring there was enough to act decisively. The next morning, he sent out a company-wide memo, calling for an emergency meeting at Stellar Sky's Grand Harbor headquarters. Every key manager, including Victor Lane, was summoned. The agenda was vague, but the tone made it clear. This wasn't a meeting anyone could afford to miss. As Daniel reviewed his notes in preparation, a knock sounded at his door. It was Emily. She looked nervous but determined. "I heard about the meeting," she said. "Are you ready for this?" Daniel nodded. "It's time." "Victor's not going to go down without a fight," Emily warned. "I know," Daniel replied, "but this isn't just about him. It's about setting things right for everyone." Emily offered a faint smile. "For what it's worth, you've already made a difference. People are starting to believe things can change." Her words bolstered Daniel's confidence. As Emily left, he turned back to his desk, a sense of calm settling over him. The road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. Stellar Skies' headquarters in Grand Harbor stood as a gleaming symbol of success, its sleek glass facade reflecting the morning sun. Inside, however, the atmosphere was far from calm. Key figures from across the company gathered in the main conference room, murmurs of curiosity filling the air. An emergency meeting called with such urgency was rare, and the lack of details only fueled speculation. Daniel entered the room quietly, dressed in his usual understated style. He carried a folder filled with carefully curated evidence, his mind sharp and focused. No one acknowledged him as anything more than another participant, a small oversight that would soon prove monumental. At the head of the table sat Victor Lane, exuding his usual air of confidence. His tailored suit and practiced smile betrayed no hint of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Beside him were other department heads, each waiting for the meeting to begin with a mix of anticipation and skepticism. The room brimmed with anticipation and skepticism as key figures waited for the meeting to begin. Emily Rivers sat at the far end of the table, her posture stiff yet calm. She caught Daniel Hayes' eye and offered a subtle nod of encouragement. Victor Lane rose to address the room, his tone confident and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering on such short notice. I've been informed this meeting concerns certain grievances about our operations. Let's not waste time." He gestured toward Daniel dismissively. "You have the floor. Please enlighten us." Daniel rose slowly, scanning the room with a steady gaze. "Thank you," he began. "Over the last several days, I've been observing the operations at one of our busiest hubs, Aurora. What I've uncovered is deeply troubling." He placed a stack of documents on the table, sliding them toward the center. "This goes beyond simple inefficiencies. There is a culture of favoritism, intimidation, and bias that is eroding the foundation of what Stellar Skies claims to stand for." The room fell silent, save for the faint rustling of papers as a few attendees picked up the documents. Victor leaned back in his chair, his smile fading into something more guarded. "Bias?" he repeated, feigning disbelief. "That's a strong accusation. Do you have specifics, or is this just conjecture?" Daniel met his gaze steadily. "I have specifics," he replied, tapping the folder in front of him. "Testimonies from employees, records of misconduct, and financial discrepancies tied directly to your leadership." Victor chuckled, but the sound lacked warmth. "Financial discrepancies? Are we really doing this?" He turned to the others in the room with a dismissive wave. "This is a waste of time. He's clearly here to stir up trouble." At the far end of the table, Emily shifted uncomfortably, her jaw tightening. Daniel raised a hand, signaling her to stay calm. "Mr. Lane," he said firmly, "these aren't baseless accusations. Every claim is supported by evidence. If you'd like, I can start with the vendor contracts you've personally approved." Victor's smile froze, his eyes narrowing. "I see what's happening here," he said coldly. "This is nothing but a smear campaign. You don't belong here. Frankly, you have no idea how a company of this size operates." Leaning forward, his tone turned sharp. "People like you don't understand what it takes to maintain success at this level. You think you can walk in, point fingers, and disrupt everything we've built? The words hung in the air, their implication clear. A few attendees shifted uncomfortably, while others avoided looking at Daniel altogether. Daniel felt a surge of anger, but kept his composure. "People like me?" he asked, his voice calm but pointed. Victor shrugged, feigning innocence. "Let's not pretend this is anything more than you trying to punch above your weight." The tension in the room reached a peak. Emily gave Daniel another subtle nod of encouragement. Taking a deep breath, Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small business card. "If there's any question about my credentials," he said, walking toward the head of the table, "let me clarify something." He placed the card in front of Victor, the embossed text glinting under the fluorescent lights. Daniel Hayes, CEO and owner, Stellar Skies Airlines. The room erupted into shocked murmurs as the weight of the revelation sank in. Victor's face drained of color, his confidence crumbling under the realization. Daniel straightened, his voice cutting through the noise. "I built this company from the ground up. I know exactly what it takes to maintain success. And I also know when someone is undermining everything it stands for." He turned to address the others in the room. "This isn't about petty grievances. This is about integrity. Stellar Skies was founded on the principle that everyone deserves respect. Employees, customers, everyone. What I've uncovered over the past week shows that those principles have been abandoned." The murmurs subsided, replaced by a heavy silence. Victor opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Daniel turned back to him, his expression resolute. "I'll be addressing each of these issues directly, starting with a full audit of your operations. If you have anything to say in your defense, now's the time." Victor's silence spoke volumes. Daniel stepped back, commanding the room with his presence. "This company is going to change, starting today. If anyone has a problem with that, you're welcome to leave." The meeting ended with an air of finality. The balance of power irreversibly shifted. The room hung in stunned silence, the weight of Daniel's revelations sinking into every corner. Victor sat frozen in his chair, his eyes locked on the business card as though it were a weapon. At the far end of the table, Emily felt a surge of relief and astonishment. She had sensed there was more to Daniel than met the eye, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. Around the room, murmurs grew louder. Some filled with disbelief, others with a newfound sense of hope. The murmurs in the room grew louder, some voices filled with disbelief, others with newfound hope. "You're the owner of Stellar Skies?" one department head finally asked, his voice laced with incredulity. "Yes," Daniel replied calmly, his gaze unwavering. "And I'm here because what I've witnessed in this company is unacceptable, starting with Victor Lane." Victor snapped out of his shock, his defensive instincts kicking in. He forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. "This is absurd," he said, shaking his head. "You can't seriously believe the accusations this man is throwing around. He doesn't know the first thing about running a company like this." Daniel took a step closer, his tone firm but composed. "I know enough to recognize corruption when I see it. I've reviewed the vendor contracts you approved. Overpriced deals with no clear deliverables. I've heard first-hand accounts from employees about your intimidation tactics and favoritism. You've built a culture of fear and exclusion that goes against everything this company stands for." The room fell silent once again as Daniel placed a thick folder on the table. "These are the financial records and employee testimonies I've gathered. If anyone here has doubts about the validity of my claims, you're welcome to review them." Victor's face turned red as he leaned forward, his voice rising. "You have no idea what it takes to keep a company of this size running. Those decisions, those so-called favoritism tactics, were made to protect the company's profitability. Sometimes hard choices have to be made." "Hard choices?" Daniel repeated, his voice sharp. "Exploiting employees? Turning a blind eye to unethical practices? That's not leadership. That's self-serving corruption." Victor stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Do you think this company would even exist without me? I've kept it running smoothly for years. Years. You can't just waltz in here and undermine everything I've built." Daniel didn't flinch. "What you've built is a house of cards, and it's about to come crashing down." Turning to the room, Daniel addressed everyone present. Effective immediately, Victor Lane is suspended from all duties pending a full investigation. An independent audit team will begin reviewing every aspect of Aurora's operations. This isn't just about one person, it's about rebuilding the trust and integrity that have been lost. The room erupted in a mix of gasps and whispers. Some of the managers looked visibly relieved, while others exchanged uncertain glances. Emily watched silently, her heart pounding. "You're making a mistake," Victor said, his voice cold and measured. "This company won't function without me. The systems I've put in place, the relationships I've cultivated, they're what keep Stellar Skies afloat. You'll see that soon enough." Daniel met his gaze steadily. "We'll manage just fine without you. And as for the systems you've put in place, they're exactly what we're going to dismantle." Victor's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. He grabbed his briefcase and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The tension in the room lingered even after he left. Daniel turned back to the table, his expression softening slightly. "To those of you who've been working under this culture, I want you to know that change is coming. We're going to rebuild this company into what it was always meant to be, a place where employees feel valued and customers are treated with respect." Emily felt a flicker of hope as she looked around the room. Some of the managers nodded, their expressions a mix of relief and determination. Daniel continued, his voice resolute. "This is just the beginning. I'll be personally overseeing the restructuring process, starting with an open forum for employees to share their experiences. Everyone's voice matters, and I'll make sure they're heard." The room began to empty, attendees filing out with mixed emotions, relief, uncertainty, and a sense that something significant had shifted. Emily lingered near the door, catching Daniel's eye as he gathered his papers. "You did it," she said quietly. "No," Daniel replied, his expression serious. "This is just step one. There's still a lot of work to do." Emily nodded, sensing the weight of his words. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, she felt like real change was possible. The conference room emptied, but Daniel remained seated, his hands resting on the polished wood table. The weight of the decisions ahead pressed heavily on him. He glanced at the thick stack of documents before him, the evidence, the testimonies, the cold, hard proof of what had gone wrong under Victor Lane's leadership. The truth was undeniable, but Daniel knew that exposing it wasn't enough. Real change required action. Later that afternoon, Daniel convened a meeting with frontline employees from the Aurora branch. The group included Emily Rivers and several other flight attendants, gate agents, and maintenance staff. They gathered in a smaller, more intimate room, the air heavy with anticipation. "Thank you for coming," Daniel began, his voice steady but warm. "I called this meeting because your voices need to be heard. You're the ones who interact with our customers every day. You're the heart of this company." Daniel Hayes addressed the gathered employees from the Aurora branch with quiet determination. "You're the ones who make Stellar Skies what it is. I want to know, what's been holding you back?" For a moment, the room was silent. Employees exchanged hesitant glances, unsure of whether to speak. Then Emily Rivers stepped forward, her expression resolute. "It's the fear," she said plainly. "Fear of making a mistake, fear of speaking up, fear of being replaced if you don't fit someone's idea of who belongs." Her courage seemed to embolden others. A gate agent spoke next. "We've been told to put up with a lot. Managers like Victor Lane make it clear that we're expendable. They care more about keeping certain people happy than about letting us do our jobs." A flight attendant added, "It's exhausting. No matter how hard you work, it's never enough. And if you're not one of their favorites, you're invisible." Daniel listened intently, his expression thoughtful. Every word confirmed what he already suspected, but hearing it directly from those affected made it deeply personal. "I understand," he said after a moment, "and I want you to know that things will change. Starting today, we're implementing a plan to rebuild the culture of this company from the ground up." He outlined his reforms: comprehensive training programs on equity and inclusion, mandatory leadership development for managers, and the establishment of a whistleblower system to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. "This isn't just about policies," Daniel added. "It's about people. We're creating opportunities for those who've been overlooked, People like Emily Rivers, who've shown dedication and integrity even in the toughest circumstances. Emily, you've proven yourself to be a leader, and it's time the company recognizes that. I'd like to promote you to a supervisory role, effective immediately. Emily's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and gratitude crossing her face. Thank you, she said softly. The room erupted into quiet applause, a glimmer of hope spreading among the employees. But not everyone welcomed the changes. News of Daniel's sweeping reforms quickly reached the company's upper echelons, including Victor Lane. Though suspended, Victor still wielded significant influence among certain shareholders and wasted no time leveraging it. In the days that followed, Daniel faced increasing scrutiny. Victor reached out to key stakeholders, warning them that Daniel's reforms would jeopardize profits and alienate long-standing partners. The tension came to a head during a call from the board of directors demanding an explanation. In the boardroom, Daniel stood before a panel of skeptical faces. These reforms are not a liability, he began firmly. They're an investment in the future of this company. Customers don't choose airlines solely based on ticket prices. They choose based on trust, on how they're treated, and on what a company stands for. If we don't fix this now, we'll lose far more than profits. We'll lose the loyalty of our employees and the respect of our customers. One director leaned forward, frowning. And what about the financial impact of these changes? Training programs, audits, new leadership, it all comes at a cost. Can you guarantee it'll pay off? Daniel hesitated only briefly, the memory of his own struggles flashing through his mind. He thought of the times he'd been dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated because of who he was. Those experiences had shaped him, but they had also given him the strength to fight for something better. I can't promise immediate results, he admitted, but I can promise this. If we continue down the path we're on, we'll collapse under the weight of our own failure. This company was built to be more than just another business. It was built to set a standard, and I'm not going to compromise that vision for short-term gains. The room fell silent as the directors exchanged uncertain glances. One by one, their expressions shifted from skepticism to reluctant understanding. After the meeting, Daniel returned to his office, his mind heavy but his resolve unshaken. Emily was waiting for him, her demeanor calm but watchful. How did it go? She asked. They're not fully convinced yet, Daniel admitted, but they'll come around. They have to. Emily nodded. For what it's worth, we believe in you. The employees, we've needed this for a long time. Daniel managed a small smile. That's what keeps me going. We're going to make this work, no matter what it takes. The conference hall buzzed with anticipation as journalists, employees, and shareholders filled the seats. Cameras lined the back wall, their lenses trained on the podium, where Daniel Hayes was set to address the public for the first time since the announcement of his reforms. The room hummed with whispers and speculation about what the CEO turned owner of Stellar Skies would say. Daniel stepped onto the stage, his expression calm and focused, ready to speak. Victor Lane's dismissal sent shockwaves far beyond the walls of Stellar Skies Airlines. Within days, whispers of controversy morphed into bold headlines splashed across major news outlets. Anonymous sources claimed that Daniel Hayes, the enigmatic CEO and owner, was exploiting the company for personal gain. Accusations of favoritism and reckless financial decisions painted a damaging picture. Daniel sat in his office, his fingers drumming rhythmically against the edge of his desk. The weight of the allegations pressed heavily on him, but his resolve did not waver. He had anticipated some retaliation from Victor, but hadn't foreseen the sheer ferocity of the smear campaign. The headlines showed no signs of slowing. Stories alleging secretive dealings and questionable hires swirled in the media, all pointing fingers at Daniel's recent reforms. One particularly scathing article read, "From visionary to villain, is Daniel Hayes destroying Stellar Skies?" Emily Rivers entered the office cautiously, a folder clutched in her hands. "Daniel," she began, her tone hesitant, "it's getting worse." She placed the documents on his desk. "These are some of the reports circulating among employees. People are scared. They don't know what to believe anymore." Daniel leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes briefly. "I knew Victor wouldn't go quietly," he said with a sigh. "But I didn't think he'd stoop this low." Emily hesitated before speaking. You've always said transparency is key, she offered carefully. Maybe it's time to show everyone exactly what's happening behind the scenes. Her words sparked an idea. Daniel straightened in his chair, his expression sharpening. You're right. If Victor wants to fight this in the shadows, I'll bring it into the light. The next day, Daniel announced a bold move, an open meeting with the company's board of directors, employees, and media representatives. The meeting would feature a comprehensive presentation of Stellar Sky's financial records and a detailed outline of the reforms being implemented. The atmosphere in the packed conference hall was electric. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras poised to capture every moment. Employees murmured anxiously among themselves, while the board members exchanged uneasy glances. Daniel stepped onto the stage, his presence commanding yet calm. He began by addressing the allegations head-on. In the past week, rumors and accusations have been circulating about my leadership and the changes happening at Stellar Skies. Daniel said, his voice steady. Let me be clear, these accusations are false, and today I'm going to prove it. He clicked a remote, and a large screen behind him lit up with graphs, charts, and detailed financial data. These are Stellar Skies financial records, audited by an independent third party, he explained. They show exactly where every dollar has been allocated since the day I took over. There's no room for ambiguity, no room for manipulation. The audience watched in silence as Daniel methodically dismantled each accusation, backing his statements with hard evidence. He spoke about the cultural changes being implemented, highlighting testimonials from employees who had already experienced positive shifts in their work environment. I believe in transparency, Daniel continued. That's why I've opened this meeting to the media, to ensure that every word spoken here today is documented. Stellar Skies will not hide behind closed doors. We will face challenges head-on. As Daniel wrapped up his presentation, a sudden commotion broke out at the back of the room. All heads turned as Victor Lane entered, flanked by two individuals carrying briefcases. He strode confidently toward the stage, a smug smile plastered across his face. Mr. Hayes, Victor began, his voice dripping with faux politeness. I couldn't resist attending your little gathering. After all, it's only fair that both sides of the story are heard. The room tensed as Victor held up a stack of papers. These, he declared, are documents that prove Daniel Hayes has been funneling company funds into personal projects, luxury properties, offshore accounts, you name it. Daniel stepped forward, meeting Victor's gaze with unflinching determination. And where exactly did you obtain these so-called documents? He asked. Victor smirked. Let's just say I have my sources. Sources? Daniel repeated, his tone sharp. Or fabrications, because I happen to have evidence of the lengths you've gone to discredit me. Anonymous emails traced back to your personal accounts, manipulated documents, and even witnesses willing to testify about your attempts to bribe them into spreading false information. Gasps rippled through the audience. Daniel turned to the crowd, his voice unwavering. This is exactly what I've been fighting against, a culture where deceit and manipulation are used to maintain power. That ends today. Emily stepped forward, taking the microphone. Her voice was clear and unwavering. I've worked under Victor Lane, she began. I've seen how he operated, how he created an environment of fear and division. Daniel Hayes is the reason people like me finally feel hope for change, Emily Rivers declared, her voice unwavering. Her words tipped the scales. One of the board members, a previously neutral figure, stood up. I've reviewed the evidence presented here today, he said, and it's clear to me that Daniel Hayes' vision for this company is the right one. I fully support his reforms. The room erupted in applause. Victor Lane's confident facade cracked, his expression hardening as he realized the tide had turned against him. Without another word, he stormed out, his plans to regain control unraveling before his eyes. Daniel turned back to the crowd, his expression resolute. This is just the beginning, he said. Stellar Skies will be a company that stands for integrity, equality, and excellence, not just in words but in actions. And nothing will stand in the way of that mission. The applause swelled, filling the room with a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt the weight of his challenges begin to lift, replaced by a quiet determination to see his vision through. The conference room was packed once again, but but this time the atmosphere was heavier. Tension was palpable as Daniel stood at the podium, holding a small flash drive between his fingers. His gaze swept the room, taking in the faces of board members, employees, media representatives, and even a few loyalists of Victor Lane who lingered in the back, their expressions carefully guarded. "Today," Daniel began, his voice calm but firm, "I'm here to close the chapter on a dark period in Stellar Sky's history. What you're about to see will not only clarify the truth, but also pave the way for a better future." He inserted the flash drive into the laptop connected to the screen behind him, and the lights dimmed as a video began to play. The room watched in stunned silence as grainy footage from an internal meeting came into view. In the video, Victor Lane sat at the head of a table, his tone confident and dismissive as he addressed a group of senior managers. "I don't care if the books don't balance," he said in the recording, leaning back in his chair. "We'll find a way to make it work. Use the discretionary fund. No one's going to question where the money went if the numbers look good on paper." The clip continued, showing Victor directing his team to inflate vendor invoices and reroute company funds into external partnerships that had no legitimate business purpose. When the video ended, the silence in the room was deafening. Daniel stepped forward again, his gaze unwavering. "This is just one example of what's been uncovered during a 5-year audit conducted by an independent team," he said. "These findings aren't just numbers, they're the reason this company has been losing the trust of its employees and customers." He clicked to the next slide, revealing detailed financial reports that outlined the scope of Victor's misuse of company funds. The evidence was irrefutable. The room erupted into murmurs. Several board members exchanged furious whispers. One finally stood, addressing Daniel directly. This is unacceptable. Victor Lane's actions are a betrayal of everything this company stands for." Another board member chimed in, their tone equally resolute. "I move to permanently sever all ties with Mr. Lane and ensure he is held accountable for his actions." The momentum was unstoppable. One by one, the remaining board members voiced their agreement, their collective outrage turning into a unanimous decision. Victor, who had been sitting stiffly in the corner, stood abruptly. His face was pale, his polished facade crumbling. "You can't do this," he sputtered, his voice losing its usual confidence. "I've given everything to this company. Without me, it wouldn't even exist." Daniel met his gaze calmly. "You're wrong, Victor. Stellar Skies exists because of the people who work hard every day to make it what it is. You've been exploiting their efforts for your own gain, and that ends now." Under the weight of the evidence and the board's unanimous decision, Victor had no choice but to leave. He walked out of the room with his head down, his departure marked by a tense silence. When the door closed behind him, Daniel turned back to the room. "Now that this chapter is behind us, it's time to move forward." He clicked to the final slide of his presentation, revealing the title, Horizons for All. "This initiative is about more than fixing what's broken," Daniel said. "It's about building something better. Starting today, we're implementing new programs to support our employees and enhance the customer experience. This includes mandatory leadership training, anonymous reporting systems, and a council of employee representatives from every branch to ensure fairness and transparency." Applause broke out, tentative at first but growing louder as Daniel outlined the details of the program. Employees nodded in agreement, their expressions shifting from skepticism to hope. And finally, Daniel continued, "The funds recovered from Victor's actions will be redirected to support these initiatives, including scholarships for employee development and improved benefits for frontline staff." As he stepped back from the podium, the applause swelled, filling the room with a sense of hope. For the first time in years, Stellar Skies felt poised to soar toward a brighter future. Scholarships, improved benefits, and a council of employee representatives to ensure accountability at every level. By the time Daniel Hayes stepped away from the podium, the room was filled with a sense of cautious optimism. Emily Rivers approached him, her eyes bright with emotion. "You did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," Daniel replied, a small smile playing at his lips. "We did it. And this is just the beginning." As the room began to empty, Daniel stood near the window, watching the city lights flicker against the evening sky. The weight of responsibility still pressed on him, but alongside it was a renewed sense of purpose. Stellar Skies was finally on a path to becoming the company he had always envisioned, a place where people, not profits, came first. The aftermath of Victor Lane's downfall was swift and public. News outlets buzzed with headlines dissecting the financial misconduct and toxic culture he had fostered during his tenure at Stellar Skies. Reporters analyzed every detail of the company's reforms, some skeptical, others cautiously optimistic. What was clear to everyone, however, was that the airline was undergoing a profound transformation under Daniel Hayes' leadership. Victor himself faced mounting legal troubles. Financial regulators launched investigations into his misuse of corporate funds, and his name became synonymous with greed and corruption in media coverage. The narrative had shifted decisively against him, leaving no escape from the consequences of his actions. Within the walls of Stellar Skies headquarters, however, a quieter, more profound transformation was taking place. Daniel had called for a private meeting with employees from Skyview Hub, the branch most affected by the culture Victor had perpetuated. The room was filled with familiar faces: Emily Rivers, several flight attendants, gate agents, and maintenance staff. "Thank you all for being here," Daniel began, his tone sincere. "I wanted this meeting to be small because I need to hear from you, the people who've been on the front lines of this company. Your experiences, your insights, they're the foundation of the changes we're making." The room was silent at first, but then Emily spoke up. "It's been hard, Daniel," she admitted, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "For a long time we felt invisible, like no one cared what we went through, as long as the numbers looked good. But now, it feels different." Another employee chimed in. "I think we're starting to believe that things can change, but there's still a lot of damage to undo. Some of us are still scared to speak up, even now." Daniel nodded, absorbing their words. "I understand, and I'm not going to pretend that one decision, or even 1 year, will fix everything. But I promise you this: we're committed to listening, learning, and making sure that fear has no place in this company." He paused, his gaze settling on Emily. "Emily, your courage throughout this process has been remarkable. You've shown what true leadership looks like, and I'd like to formally offer you a management position. Your voice needs to be part of the decisions we make moving forward." Emily's eyes widened in surprise, her expression a mix of shock and gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice cracking with emotion. "I won't let you down." As the meeting continued, employees shared more stories, both painful and hopeful. Daniel listened intently, taking notes and asking questions. He made it clear that their feedback wasn't just being heard, it was shaping the future of Stellar Skies. Later that evening, Daniel found himself alone in his office. He stared at a framed photo on his desk, a picture taken years ago when Stellar Skies was still just an idea. In it, a younger Daniel stood in front of a modest office building, his expression one of determination and hope. He thought back to why he had started this journey in the first place. As a young man, he had experienced firsthand the sting of being underestimated and dismissed because of his background. He had vowed to create something better, not just a company, but a culture where everyone, regardless of who they were, could feel valued. But over time, that vision had been overshadowed by the demands of growth and success. He had trusted people like Victor Lane to uphold the values he had built the company on, and in doing so, he had let those values slip. Now, with the damage laid bare, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. "This was never just about me," Daniel murmured to himself. "It's about what we stand for, what we can be." The next morning, Daniel addressed the entire company in a live-streamed broadcast. Standing before a backdrop emblazoned with Stellar Skies' logo, he spoke from the heart. Stellar Skies was founded on the belief that people matter more than profits. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. But today, we're taking it back. We're rebuilding this company into what it was always meant to be, a place of opportunity, fairness, and trust. He announced the creation of the Horizons for All program, which included scholarships for employees, improved benefits, and a council of employee representatives to ensure accountability at every level. "This isn't just about fixing what's broken," Daniel concluded. "It's about building something better, together." The response was immediate. Messages of support poured in from employees, customers, and even industry competitors. Daniel felt the tide turning, not just for the company, but for the people who made it what it was. As the broadcast ended, Daniel stood in the empty studio, his reflection faint in the glass walls. The journey ahead would be long, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready. Stellar Skies wasn't just an airline. It was a symbol of what was possible when people came together with a shared vision. And Daniel was determined to keep that vision alive. The grand ballroom of Zenith Airways' headquarters had been transformed for a historic celebration. Elegant banners draped the walls, each bearing the company's newly adopted slogan, "Horizons for All." The room was filled with employees, shareholders, and loyal passengers. Excitement buzzed in the air, a tangible energy that signaled the beginning of something extraordinary. Daniel Hayes stood near the back of the room for a moment, quietly observing the crowd. The conversations, the laughter, and the hope in the air were everything he'd dreamed of bringing back to this company. Emily Rivers approached him, her calm demeanor masking the excitement in her eyes. "They're ready for you," she said with a small smile, motioning toward the stage. Daniel nodded, adjusting his tie as he made his way forward. The room fell silent as he climbed the steps and faced the crowd, their attention fixed on him. He paused for a moment, taking it all in, before he began to speak. "Today," he said, his voice steady but warm, "we're not just celebrating a program, we're celebrating a promise to every employee, every passenger, and every person who believes that business can and should be a force for good." He gestured toward the banners lining the walls. Horizons for All isn't just a name, it's a commitment to fairness, respect, and opportunity. This company has faced challenges, yes, but challenges don't define us. How we respond to them does. The audience erupted into applause, but Daniel raised a hand to quiet them. "I want to take a moment to recognize the people who made this possible. The employees who had the courage to speak out, the customers who stayed loyal to us, and the shareholders who believed in the vision of a better Zenith Airways. You are the reason we're here today." He paused, his expression growing more serious. Change doesn't come from the most powerful people in the room. It comes from those willing to stand up for what's right, no matter who they are. That's what this company is about, and that's what it will always stand for. This time, the applause was thunderous. The crowd rose to their feet in a standing ovation, their support resonating through the grand hall. Daniel smiled, his gratitude evident, and stepped back from the podium. As the ceremony concluded, guests mingled, exchanging congratulations and reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. An older gentleman approached Daniel, his weathered face betraying years of wisdom, his sharp eyes filled with kindness. Daniel recognized him immediately. It was one of the passengers from the flight that had sparked this journey. "You're Daniel Hayes," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "I am," Daniel replied, extending his hand. The man shook it warmly. "I was there on that flight. I saw how you handled yourself. Standing up not just for yourself, but for everyone. What you're doing here, it matters. It gives people like me hope." Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat but managed to keep his composure. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "That means more than you know." The man patted Daniel's shoulder. "Keep going. Don't let anything stop you." As the man disappeared into the crowd, his words lingered, resonating deeply within Daniel. Later that evening, Daniel stood in his office, looking out over the New York City skyline. The light stretched endlessly before him, a breathtaking view that mirrored the endless possibilities ahead. The journey had been long and filled with challenges, but it had also been transformative. Each setback, each victory, they were all part of the path that had led Zenith Airways to this moment. Daniel thought back to the promises he'd made, to rebuild not just a company, but its very culture, to create a workplace and a business that valued people over profits. Those promises were no longer just ideas, they were becoming reality. He reached out to the framed photo on his desk. In it, a younger Daniel stood in front of a modest office building, his expression determined and full of hope. "This was never just about me," he murmured to himself. "It's about what we stand for, what we can become." As he turned back to the city lights, Daniel allowed himself a small, quiet smile. The future of Zenith Airways was brighter than ever, not because of what had already been achieved, but because of the people who were committed to carrying the vision forward. This was just the beginning. Outrow. Daniel Hayes' journey isn't just a story about transforming a company. It's a reminder of what can happen when courage meets determination. Real change begins with standing up for what's right, no matter the obstacles or the opposition. What about you? What change would you fight for in your world? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the power we have to make a difference.